So good morning or good afternoon. My name is Joel Berkowitz. I'm professor of English and director of Jewish studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And it is my great honor to moderate this session on post-Khurbn Yiddish literature, the making of new genres. We have a very full session with four presenters. So we're going to jump right in and keep a close eye on the clock. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first presenter on the panel, Dominic Williams from Northumbria University, speaking on Yael Levi Bruchstein's Night Shift, 1947, an early encounter with the Auschwitz Sonderkommando.
Thanks, Joel. Yes, as you see from the title, I've taken off 1947 because I think it's a rather more complicated than to just date it to that point. Just to say a couple of things in advance. One, this is a conference on the Holocaust, but a content note always seems appropriate when you're talking about the Sonderkommando. It is talking about some of the more difficult aspects of the Holocaust, of course, and I should also say probably there's material here which is pretty offensive as well. I think I can straightforwardly say that. Although I hope there's something interesting to be said about it. And finally, I just want to say this is pretty new work for me. I think the conference prompted me to come back and try and do some work with Yiddish, having created my time away on other subjects. So it is work in progress. Obviously, if there's things that you see that are wrong, please do let me know, but I'm happy to take comments on board. So, okay, the title that I've given here is An Early Encounter with the Auschwitz Sonderkommando. And what I mean by encounter here is a number of things, but partly taking into account Pollock and Daniel Agostinho talked about encounters, although also drawing on, I suppose, common sense ideas of what the idea of encounter is. And it's really my way of thinking about, or trying to think about, memory that's not simply one where the person who's remembering has all the power, or alternatively, where the material has the power, and what you might call the kind of traumatic models sometimes seem to have a sense that, you know, it is unmasterable what it is that the material that you're encountering. And here Pollock and Agostinho are talking about ideas of how encounters with something unexpected that involves a different kind of relationship than one where one person is in control, but also something where there's an element of ethical responsibility, even if that responsibility is not quite lived up to. And what I'm going to try to say in looking at this text and what I know, or what we're able to say about its staging, is that even in this extreme case of what I think you can just straightforwardly, and following on from what Eric and Kasia were talking about in the last panel, can straightforwardly call Stalinist Holocaust memory. There are ways in which that's not straightforwardly being mastered and turned into propaganda, amongst other things. So I'm talking here about the playwright Yael Bruchstein, or Ludwig Bruchstein, who was born in 1920, grew up in Siget, deported to Auschwitz on the same train as Elie Wiesel, returned as a survivor to Romania, and began a literary career from fairly early on, editor of a local newspaper, Unser Leben, which is from Siget, and perhaps produced a manuscript, or in some sense produced a manuscript of Nachtschicht, Night Shift, the play about the Sonderkommando uprising. He often dates it to 1947, although the first production is in 1949, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. There's a literary career that he has in Yiddish, so certainly mainly as a playwright to start off with, so certainly Nachtschicht, And okay, here's unser Leben, one example of the paper. We'll come back to that. Certainly another play, Die Mischpoche Grünwald, from 1953, is originally in Yiddish as well. And then a number of plays that I've only managed to locate Romanian versions of. I suppose I should note, this is the only copy of the second play, Die Mischpoche Grünwald, that I think it is available in a university library in the UK, with a rather spectacular self-own from the way that it's been labelled there, as you can see. So a career in Yiddish and then in Romanian, moved to Israel, and I think mainly writes in Romanian. Often it seems that wasn't published, but there are Hebrew translations and other language. There's an S on that, and other languages. So very recently, since about 2020, a number of his works translated from Romanian have appeared in English. Unser Leben was the newspaper of the Komitet Demokrat Evreisk, the Jewish Democratic Committee in Siget. Bruckstein was the editor, and only 4 issues, and I think you can see there that things that are covered are Zionism in a rather more sympathetic way than Nachtschicht covers it, and also a lot of interest in memorializing Auschwitz. They talk literally in the pages of this newspaper of a pre-Auschwitz and a post-Auschwitz time. So this is in 1947, they're thinking before and after Auschwitz. And one of the things they talk about is raising funds, or unveiling a memorial to those deported to Auschwitz, which is talked about in 1947, as unveiled in 1948. Nachtschicht was produced by the Jewish State Theatre in Bucharest, the first production produced by that theatre company under that name. There was a company that preceded it called Irkuf, from Yiddish Kulturverband. And there are related productions that I think it's worth being aware of, just to say that there's interest in dramatizing the Holocaust before. So Karina Petrescu and Mihai Lukács talk about Moshe Pinchevsky's play Ich Lebe. And not quite in the State Theatre, although it's with a lot of people from the same cast. Chaim Slovis is Nekomanema, and Annette Aronovich, I think, as Joel mentioned a couple of days ago, has done a lot of the work on Slovis there. That's the vast bulk of what's been published. Worth also perhaps mentioning that the same theatre produced a diary of Anne Frank in 1957. One of the things that it's famous for there is that Anna Paulka, who had been the foreign minister in Romania, is reported and had been arrested, released after Stalin had died, and spent the rest of her limited years before she died of cancer as a translator. But she attended a production of the Diary of Anne Frank and is reported to have left it in tears, and people had noticed this. Someone who was not did not have much of a public life, as someone who was Jewish but straightforwardly as a communist, although her Jewishness was known. This demo, I think, is important in that you can see the cast is almost a large number of members of the cast played in both plays. So I've just highlighted a few there where you can see almost all of the main characters are played by people who also end up playing in Nachtschicht. And the person highlighted in red there, Maurizio Seckler, played the kind of main figure, Victor, in Nekomanema, was the director of Night Shift. And I think from what I can glean of this Romanian program, there are a number of ways in that what this is different from the text that is generally available for Slovis's play. And one of those is that there are, instead of one person who's an onzoger, an announcer, there are two women who play the part of vestitoireles, they talk about here, announcers, harbingers, I think. And it looks, so if you see where I've just put the yellow where they mentioned the vestitoirele, the Onzogerinnen, the structure seems to have been slightly changed from the text that's generally available. And these two announcers are speaking at the beginning of each act and kind of framing it. And it may well be that that's something that had an influence on Night Shift, because Bockstein himself complained about the fact that the prologue and the epilogue, which are set in present-day Romania and include two women who are talking about what's happening in the what happened to them and their husbands who are survivors from the Sonderkommando, and we then go back into the main part of the play, and a lot of that is essentially framing it and saying, well, okay, we are now in a very different night shift that they're undertaking. This is building a better country in a very kind of already sort of utopian vision of what it is that Romania is. The scenes themselves in Night Shift are pretty much what you would expect. I think in a lot of ways it's a fairly workaday play, but it is what you would expect for it to happen in a play about the Sonderkommando. They arrive in Auschwitz, try to make sense of what has happened to them and their families. Then they're called to the first night shift. Then are their reactions to it. They decide they're going to revolt. Someone is about to betray them, and then they manage to revolt. And the final scene ends with them blowing up one of the crematoria and saying, we're starting a fire that will bring down fascism overall. And most of them, unlike the historical record, most of them survive, or at least two of them survive to be there in the present and returning to their wives. A couple of photos that you can see there. This is from scene 2, and this one is from scene 5. Just a couple of things to say here. So as I said, this is even with this incredibly difficult material, and it doesn't scant that in a number of ways, it clearly has a point of view which is saying that it is working class Jews who are the resistors, who are the decent people, upper class Jews who are not even really Jews, as you can see here in this part. Jakob says Jews who are trying to escape, who were able to buy their way out, weren't Jews. They were bankers, factory owners, textile magnates, just as those on the other side weren't Germans or Hungarians, but Nazis and arrow crossers, I suppose. And then Jakob, who gets a lot of these kind of propagandistic talks, says, you know, you're listening to Radio London. That didn't tell you about what was going on in the camps. That was just telling you about rich people in Vienna. Okay, I listened to Radio Moscow. They told me about the camps. They told me about fascism. They told me about imperialism. And as he says there, that is imperialism is something that the country of socialism, Soviet Union, therefore, will defeat, however many times it may show itself and whatever mask it may wear. And in fact, he also says, I was informed by listening to Radio Moscow, I was actually able to escape, and I just got unlucky that I got to Auschwitz, whereas you were essentially kind of dupes. That mask reference, I think, is quite important. It's a recurrent theme in Romanian communist, Romanian Stalinist discourse, often by Jewish Stalinists themselves. So that Zionism was something that needed to be unmasked. So you can see from 1944 that the ethnic Hungarian Vasily Luka, who was an ally in a lot of ways, I think, of Anna Palka, describes in a speech in 1944 that Zionism was reactionary fascism and needed to be unmasked. Elvira Gertzinger mentions a number of times through Ikhof-Blätter articles with titles about unmasking Zionists, the need to unmask Zionists. So this is just one example that is there. It's a recurrent theme. It appears in Ikhof-Blätter and certainly in her discussion of it. And not surprisingly, then, the person who is the bourgeois, the person who betrayed the revolt, is Sacher, who is the Zionist, although not in any kind of sincere way, and someone who loves the English, but essentially someone who would be willing to do a deal with anybody. So here you can see he's willing to do a deal with British imperialism. He has land in Palestine. But when the other character asks him, well, what happens if the Nazis win? He says, well, they'll give us land in Kenya and that will be okay as well. So Zaka is also the person who shows the greatest amount of fear, not entirely surprisingly, therefore he's the coward, who is the person who betrays the revolt and says, starts off here saying, I want to live, offers them money, and then after Muller was Shafir and Muller refuses to accept it, says, okay, then I'll tell you about the plan that's going on here, which causes some difficulties for the members of the Sonderkommando, but doesn't eventually stop the plot. They are eventually able to get the SS men and tie them up, as I think you can sort of see. I'll come back to this. As you can sort of see in this scene here, there's more or less some kind of there we go. That looks to be kind of ropes around these people in what I mean, just from the look of it physically, is possibly making use of a kind of comic register there. There also seems to be something that the SS men's fear too seems to be something that is at least potentially playable for comedy. Right, so this is therefore dealing with the subject of the Sonderkommando and turning it into something that's entirely in line with, or at least it looks like, the kind of way in which communists were talking about. Okay, there is more complexity there, but certainly there are elements of this kind of discourse of we can't trust Zionists, we need to unmask Zionists. It's something they are crypto-fascists essentially, and this seems to be something that's being played out in this play. Bruchstein himself said that it was the prologue and the epilogue were the things that gave it this sort of Stalinist framing, but it seems to be woven absolutely into the fabric of it, though exactly how much of that was done by him and how much was done by the censors is still something that I need to look into or decide whether it was even possible to know. It's interesting nonetheless that there are, it was a play that seems to have been relatively popular in terms of successful or acceptable. One person here, Yud Schechter, talking in the Romanian language magazine from Tel Aviv, Izvoare, from 1978, says that this play was incredibly powerful. It was so powerful that he thought the only way that it could have been written was by somebody who had died himself. And you can see there also that when he met Bruchstein at the literature school in Bucharest, he was still alive, but the censors had forced him to make changes. And in some sense, that too, he said, was a death. Sorry
to interrupt. Could you wrap up?
Yes, no problem. So, having said that it's a propaganda piece, the final point that I want to kind of make is it is dealing with this very difficult material as well. And one of the ways I think it deals with that difficulty is to say that whereas, I mean, the Sonderkommando are figures who are collaborators in some sense, seen as collaborators, but also resistors, right? And the way that often is dealt with is by splitting those and say there are collaborators. And one way that is done, for example, is to say, well, okay, there were these liquidations and there are, so for example, you could talk about a set of shifts, a set of squads that didn't resist and then one people who stood up and did it. But interesting, that's not the way that this play approaches it. Jakob, the person who's the ardent communist, although there's a Soviet figure as well, who's really kind of educating people. Jakob is the person who is put in a position where he is both the most ardent communist and the person who goes through the most excruciating experience that you talk about with the Sonderkommando, which is that he put his mother into the ovens with his own hands. And I think the way the play solves that probably is that he has to die, right? It's difficult to deal with it, but nonetheless, it's trying to put him in the same figure. So that is a sense why I'm trying to say that it's not straightforward to say this is just Stalinism remaking the story of the Sonderkommando, remaking even this most difficult moment into propaganda. It seems in some sense to be dealing with the difficulties of trying to represent or think about the Sonderkommando as well. And that's why I think it is fair enough to call it an encounter. Unequal, but nonetheless some kind of encounter. Thank you very much.
Dominic, thank you for that fascinating start to this panel. It gives us a lot to dig into, and we'll move right on to the next presenter, who is Samuel Spinner from Johns Hopkins University, speaking about monuments of books.
Did I successfully unmute myself? Well, that'll be for the first time in history. So thank you all for being here. And thank you to the organizers for this incredible opportunity to speak to people who we all share an object of study. We know to one degree or another what we're talking about, and we can forego all those awkward translations and explications of who and what our writers, our actors, our historical contexts are. And it's just very exciting. My plan at first, and reflected in the title of my talk, was to just speak about a work by Trunk, Yiddish Trunk, which is a case study of my current book project. But then I realized that in order to explain what I'm thinking about Trunk and my thinking on him and my research on him, it's very much in progress in the beginning stages, it would be necessary to talk about my larger thinking about monumentality in general. And so I'll talk a little bit about Trunk, and I'll talk a little bit about another book series that really kicked off my thinking on the question of monumentality in literature and Holocaust monumentality in literature. And another sort of advantage that I hope to reap from this opportunity in presenting a few words about my broader thinking is the hope that with so many experts on the area present, that you might give me what to think about in relation to the larger aims of my project, as well as in relation to Trunk. So far outnumbering Holocaust monuments of stone are monuments of books. As all of us here today know well, there are hundreds, perhaps even thousands of Yiddish books from the first 25 years or so after the Holocaust that were written with the express purpose of serving a commemorative function, of serving, in a way, as monuments. There are three Yiddish words for monument: Denkmal, Monument, Matzeve. The first derived from German, the second derived from Latin, and the third with a Hebrew etymology. Translating roughly, memorial, monument, gravestone, each word contains the resonances of divergent etymologies, memorial traditions, and each signals the conceptual, linguistic, and literary archives on which monumentality in European culture, in European Jewish culture, and in European Yiddish literature drew. My current project, as I said, is on monumentality, broadly conceived, encompassing its aesthetics, its social functions, and its memorial work in relation to Yiddish literature after the Holocaust. My thinking on this project began with my encounter with the Argentine Yiddish book series Das Polnische Judentum, and I'm not sure if they're on the Zoom today, but two of the leading experts on this book series, Jan Schwartz and Malena Chinsky, are here at the conference at least, which is very exciting. And as I was reading through their secondary works and trying to read through the 175 volumes of this book series, I was kind of stumped about what it was. The book series, Das Polnische Judentum, was published under the editorship of Mark Turkov from 1946 to 1966, published in Buenos Aires. It eventually totaled 175 volumes, making it one of the largest scale book series in Yiddish anywhere in the world. The sheer scale of the project and the number of writers globally that it enlisted made a huge impact, and that impact was amplified by its quality. So many books that we're familiar with, including world famous books like the original Yiddish version of what became Wiesel's Night, were first published in this book series, books by Chaim Grade, Khurbn, and so on and so forth. It's a complex project, and it clearly can't be reduced to an analysis of the individual books in the series. Its complexity and the ways that it generated meaning and crafted memory demand a way to account and sort of navigate between the individual parts and their sum, and to understand how the whole exceeds them aesthetically, formally, stylistically. The meaning of Turkov's project is found, so I began to realize, in the relations, of course, between each book as a book, but then also between and among each book as part of a series and the series as such. This was a series as a monument, eventually, a monument characterized by literary seriality. Why and how did I arrive at the recognition that it was to be, or fruitfully conceived of, as a monument? Well, that is because Turkov did. In his own words, the book series was a bicher monument, a monument of books. And he doesn't call it that in the intro or the foreword to the first volume. I forget exactly where it comes, I think number 20, later on in any case. And reading that, sort of arriving with Turkov at the crystallizing notion of a monument of books, a bicher monument, helped unlock a certain perspective for me on the entire literary landscape of post-Holocaust Yiddish literature. What kind of monument did Turkov have in mind? It seems that based on the many forewords, introductions, and similar paratexts that Turkov wrote for the books in the series, that he was guided by two overarching objectives. The first was to consolidate an identity, whatever was encapsulated or described by das Polnische Judentum, to consolidate that identity in order to then be able to commemorate it. The second was to create an institution that would do the commemoration. That this institution was a literary institution was, of course, at least in part due to financial constraints. Statues are expensive. But it was also a question of audience and of interest and of modes of commemoration that were available and meaningful within the cultural context. Broadly speaking, and there's a lot more to say here, the audience for a public-facing monument commemorating murdered Jews simply didn't exist, and certainly not on the scale that it came to decades later, when the sort of boom that we're still in of public Holocaust monuments, memorials, museums began. In the first 2 decades after the Holocaust, most monuments, actual monuments, stone or brick things, were relatively small scale and were typically located in cemeteries or at the sites of killing. So these were not outwardly directed, publicly placed monuments. These were inwardly directed, addressing an audience that was an audience that read Yiddish. So if you tell the story of Holocaust monuments as it has been told prominently and in detail, by looking only at bricks and stones, then you conclude that the generation of survivors and pre-war exiles, for the most part, mourned a destruction of unprecedented scale, with the most modest and ubiquitous of precedents, the gravestone, or maybe some small statues. But there's another story, of course, that of books. Books were modest in cost, but not in ambition. They were not truly public, but not at all private. They weren't geographically restricted. They matched sociologically and aesthetically the global Yiddish diaspora after the Holocaust. When I first read Turkov's phrase, bicher monument, I was kind of, taken with this, and it made sense out of the book series. But then I began to realize that that this, of course, isn't unique. And of course, many people here have written on aspects of the memorial culture, its political and its aesthetic forms in the decades after the Holocaust, the context into which Turkov's work fits. And of course, Turkov's series, even as a series, let alone as a commemorative project, was not unique. It fits into a landscape with hundreds and hundreds, thousands upon thousands of Yiddish books. And what Turkov was working in was a tradition of monumentality that was not exclusively or largely physical or object-based, as the tradition of monumentality had become in broader European culture. Turkov was working with a tradition of literary monuments, memorial books. This tradition goes back to the Middle Ages, the memoir Bicher of medieval Ashkenazic Jews, books in which Jews recorded the names of martyrs in long necrologies that also included lists of destroyed communities. And these books became the basis for the list of names used in the Yizkor prayers, a practice which eventually became almost universal in Jewish communities and is still practiced to this day on holidays. So this is obviously a very present tradition, both ritually and in terms of its physical aspect, the production of books, the lists of names. This tradition fed into, as scholars have noted, into what we now call Yizkor Bicher, the tradition of memorial books that had kicked off initially with a handful of books composed in the aftermath of the pogroms in Ukraine, and eventually proliferating into the dozens, hundreds, and perhaps even totaling up to or somewhat over 1,000 Holocaust Yizkor books, most of which were published before around 1980, let's say. There's obviously a lot more to say about Yizkor books, but for Mark Turkov, they were only one option among the many commemorative forms with which he was experimenting. And in fact, Turkov's series featured a number of different types of Yizkor books. This was a genre that was in flux, in a commemorative landscape that was in flux. So what was he thinking? What type of Yizkor book or Yizkor series was this? What was its purpose? Here's how he describes his Aufgabe, his task, in the foreword to the first volume of the series. Sorry, I couldn't get the cut and paste from my my Yiddish scan to work, so it's garbled, but I have the English in Microsoft Word, so apologies. I'll be reading for this bit just the English. Turkov says, quote, that the objective is to quote, familiarize the broad Yiddish reading public with all issues relating to the destroyed life of Poland's Jews. Okay, so like this is enormous, all issues. Turkov goes on that the books should, quote, offer an all-round and strictly non-partisan reflection, the word uses Spiegelung, reflection of every aspect and every area of the social, political, and cultural production of Polish Jewry, end quote. And he goes on, he says it should not only be a reflection of the past, but, quote, through the dissemination of the series should make a contribution to the renowned history of Polish Jewry. So it's a reflection of something past and closed, but it's also a contribution to something ongoing. A reflection, the most exact kind of copy of something so much larger than the medium selected to represent it. The upshot is that the border between the thing to be represented and the thing doing the representing, that is between Polish Jewry, however that's defined, and between a series of books, was blurred. This is the famous, or I suppose well-known, map territory fallacy, and calls to mind the most memorable version of the map territory fallacy articulated by Borges in 1946, his story on exactitude in science. But I'll turn now very briefly to Yiddish Trunk, at whom I arrived because he eventually contributed 4 volumes to Turkov's book series. But what caught my attention in its grappling with the same issues that come out of Turkov's effort to construct a Bicher monument emerged from Trunk's magnum opus, Heulen, sich Reines and Bilder, which was published between 1944 and 1953, totaling eventually 7 volumes. These 7 volumes mirror the ambition, if not quite the length, of Das Polnische Judentum, but Trunk, his whole career long before the war and after, was enormously prolific. And if anybody could have, he probably could have single-handedly written 175 volumes in a book series. So stopping at 7 was, not a reflection of a project that had a clear-cut terminus. And the same thing is true of Turkov. This is an important feature of seriality in that the question of its endpoint isn't necessarily predetermined. Trunk began his book or his book series, Peulen, just days after his arrival in New York in 1941, after fleeing Poland in 1939 and wending his way around the world. And the circumstances of its composition shaped its dual aim. It was a memoir of his life and a memorial. And it was a memorial that used his own biography as a springboard for a wide-ranging description of Polish Jewish culture, but also as an example of Polish Jewish culture. It's thus paradoxically both a whole and a fragment, a description of just one Polish Jewish life and of all Polish Jewish life and of all Polish Jewish lives. The 2 parts of the subtitle, or rather the 2 parts of the title, the subtitle, Sich Reines and Bilder, and the title, Peulen, reveal the impossible task Trunk set for himself. He wished to evoke the totality of Jewish Poland out of an aggregate of textual fragments, out of a piecemeal presentation of individual lives. Here's how he himself put it in the foreword to the 7th volume. Ich hab gegeben Peulen, and it's worth noting that he uses geben, interesting verb here. Ich hab gegeben Peulen, I gave Poland. Peulen, wie es hat sich sublimiert in Leben, in die Beziehungen von einer gewissen polnischen Jid. Und das ist Wahnwitzigkeit. I gave Poland, I offered Poland, I represented Poland as it was sublimated in the life and the relations of a particular Polish Jew, and that was Wahnwitzigkeit, yours truly.
Schuldig, I'll need to ask you to wrap up as well.
Yes, I have just a little bit to go. And Trunk believed this was possible because, as he put it in that same foreword, das verschiedenartige jüdische Leben in Polen ist in Toch gewesen zusammengebunden in dem Stil von an Eins. The multifarious Jewish life of Poland was ultimately bound up in the style of an Eins, of a unity. And he goes on to say that this social fact is the sort of ground level premise of an aesthetic issue, or rather an aesthetic area, and that is of style. So the question of the monumentality of an autobiographical work, of how well Trunk's life could represent Polish Jewry, is answered aesthetically as a matter of style. But paradoxically, his style wasn't unified. And this is what makes it particularly interesting in the way it presents an effort at a monumental total. His book, each individual one, even its chapters, are marked by fragmentary form. It's episodic. It's episodic both because the biography is episodic, but it also has a literary or places itself in a literary tradition, with chapters marked by brief phrases describing the contents to come in the style of early European novels and also of Yiddish chapbooks, offering a sort of formal fragmentariness that parallels the necessary fragmentariness of the individual's life. So how does he produce a monument out of this one person, a monument to millions of people? Ultimately, and this is sort of an argument that then coalesces not only out of Trunk and Turkov, but readings of many other works, a monument emerges not as a final form, but in its creation, not as a dialectic, but as a process of iteration. Iteration is a quality of seriality. And serial monumentality does not only click into place with the last volume, its monumentality also does not entail an evasion or repair of its fragmentariness. Indeed, the 7 volumes of Trunk's Poilin end with fragments describing the shtetl of Kuzmir, before ending with a final fragment describing Trunk's own departure from Poilin. He describes walking out his front door with his wife, his daughter, and a bundle of manuscripts under his arm. In dus is alles Ding, was is mir übergeblieben von Polen. And that was finally all that was left to me of Poland. And in the end, all that's left were words and books. And so out of those words and into books is how Trunk and Turkov built their monuments. Thank you.
Sam, thank you very much. And we will turn next to Yael Levi from Harvard University, speaking about Radiant Jews in a Dark World, writing in Yiddish after the Holocaust.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation? Okay. So hi and thank you. The debate over the role of the Yiddish language and culture after the near complete destruction of its European centers in the Holocaust was evoked during the war and intensified after 1945. In his book, Survivors and Exiles, Yiddish Culture After the Holocaust, Jan Schwartz argues that post-Holocaust Yiddish writers and readers shared the same purposes: to commemorate and witness the destruction of the Jewish world in Europe and continue to develop a modern Yiddish culture. In the framework of this short talk, I examined the 1967 collection I keep recalling, Ich tu der Monen, by the Yiddish-American writer Yankov Gladstein. Through this case study, I analyzed the distinction between commemorating the past and developing the future of the Yiddish language and culture, using the theoretical framework of Diana Taylor's The Archive and the Repertoire. Taylor's distinction between repertoire and the archives in response to trauma is telling when considering the work of Yiddish writers after the Holocaust. I argue that Gladstein suggests a unique take on culture and memory and the possibilities of dealing with collective trauma. In her book, The Archive and the Repertoire, Diana Taylor provides a new understanding of the vital role of performance in the Americas. While the archival memory is restored in documents, maps, texts, archaeological remains, or digital products, which are all considered as resistant to change, the repertoire enacts embodied memory, performances, gestures, orality, movement, dance, singing, all those acts usually thought out as ephemeral. Moreover, the repertoire requires presence. One must take part in the performance. Taylor argues that the repertoire of embodied memories offers alternative perspectives to those derived from the written archives. As Taylor argues, quote, the rift doesn't lie between the written and the spoken word, but between the archive of supposedly enduring materials and the so-called ephemeral repertoire of embodied practices. End quote. Archival memory separates the source of knowledge from the knower in time or in space, while the repertoire enacts embodied memory. The concept of performance is essential in this case as a means to rethink cultural streams and narratives. Using the conceptualization to portray Gladstein's post-Holocaust poetry is a valuable tool for understanding the contradictory patterns of memory and recalling. In the preface to Gladstein's 1967 collection, he writes, "I have called this collection of all my Holocaust poems Khurbn Lieder. I keep recalling, Khurbn, not only as a stimulus to eternal remembrance, Ele Ezkera, but also simply in order to remember and remind everyone that we must not forget. I started to write this Khurbn Lieder when the twinges in my Jewish bones first sensed the coming stormy weather for the Jews, when I foresaw that this tragedy was advancing upon us. I keep recalling, and I will remember as long as I live, when I lie down and when I rise. All the poems in this collection are the records of murdered days and nights that almost do not count in the totality of the days of our lives. I keep recalling that Jews must never forget what Germany did to you." And he adds the Hebrew quote, "Asher asta lecha Germania," which is a take on Asher asa lecha Amalek, of course. This preface lays the foundation for Gladstein's credo in this book, memory as an obligation and an imperative. What Germany did to you refers to the biblical verse in Deuteronomy, "Remember what Amalek did unto thee." The obligation to recall and remember when I lie down and when I rise refer to the commandment to recite the Shema prayer morning and night. These imperatives are obligations explicitly commanded in the Torah and thus bear a ritual significance of the highest order, mitzvah deoraita. The link between the act of recalling and the daily ritual when I lie down and when I rise is Gladstein's own link. Memory for him is not only or mainly about recording the past, but rather about doing the responsible thing in the present and in the future. It is not about a history that was, but rather about the present and the future. In the poem I keep recalling, first published in the collection Radiant Jews in 1946, and later in the collection I keep recalling, Gladstein demonstrates this principal idea. The poems and the collection's title, "Tu der Monen," literally I do recalling or I keep recalling, exemplifies the liturgy ritual imperative. In Yiddish, the construction ton, do, plus the noun has a spectral meaning. It is a marker of habitual present. This habitual present is the ritual. One is constantly reminded, or one constantly reminds others of the Khurbn. It is in the present tense rather than the past, a repertoire rather than an archive, in Taylor's words. I'm reading now from the poem. I want to mention these additional things, the individual smaller holocausts that ripened in me. This long poem, 13 pages, is a personal account of the poet's private history, a biography of his world and his lost worlds. For Gladstein, forever an introspectivist, the history is a personal reflection of his biography. However, as the poem develops, the individual lens becomes wider and broader and bears cultural and communal dimensions. I remember how the whole dear living Bible became a moving aquarium, with such many splendored flickering iridescence that the Bible sparkled and became surrounded with precious gems. Ringed with the clarity of Rashi's commentary, till it became the interpreted and lucidly sung history of my own people. I, the least of persons, skinny as a stick, began to rule over a Jewish history of my own. I cried out, "Let there be light," and volumes of the Talmud and Midrash lightened up. The principle of the poem is the living energy of Jewish memory. His private biography, Jewish history, and the Jewish canon all become a moving aquarium, and the individual Jew, the poetic I, begins to rule and becomes the creator of personal history, a God who commands, like in Genesis, let there be light, and creates a new world. Here, Gladstein maintains his poetic identity as a modernist and an introspectivist. The poetic eye is the focus of the poem, and his personal experience dictates the narrative. His commitment to modernism is also evident in the term Holocausts, Khurbns, in plural, which demonstrates the modernist, even cubist point of view, not a one and only Holocaust, definitive and incomparable to any other disaster, but a kaleidoscope of personal and communal disasters, small fractures of a demolished world, which the poetic eye focuses on. Small Khurbns. The absolute poetic novelty, however, lies in Gladstein's ability to reinvent Yiddish as a poetic language. An example of this novelty is the phrase ringed with clarity of Rashi's commentary in the Yiddish original, Arum Gerashit, a neologism of Gladstein. Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the author of a comprehensive commentary on the Hebrew Bible and the Talmud, is transformed into a verb using the preposition around, arum, the acronym Rashi, and the past participle gerashit, to create a new word, a new verb. Rashi's canonical commentary alters a productive option for present and future writers, enabling them to take classical sources and repeatedly perform them in new, innovative ways. Making Rashi into a verb is merely an aesthetic skill. It is the project's core. Gladstein takes the sacred text and charges them with a new life. Just
Je fragt in demselbe Kekasche, laut deiner Meinung, muss die Aufgabe von der jüdischen Poeten der heutigen Zeit. Mir dachte sich, als viele das so, trug sich ein Element von Bewusstsein. In anderen Worten, je hau, als wenn ein Poet, wenn man so ein Poet, ein Mensch, was ist noch nicht kein Poet. Ein Mensch, was hat in sich die alle Neigungen von einem Poet. Den Willen zu sein ein Poet und die alle Fähigkeiten von einem Poet, setzt sich weg und setzt sich weg beim Tisch und hebt uns Schaffen in den Rahmen von gewissen Aufgaben für ein Poet für die heutige Zeit. Wenn es von seiner Seite, wenn ein Poet sich Kinder sehr wegsetzen, in Trachten, in die Rahmen von Meinungen, von Aufgaben für die jüdischen Poeten in der heutigen Zeit, halt ich von der gewissen, warf mal einen Blick auf zurück. Das ist eine Zeit. Es ist gewinner Zeit, wenn ein jüdischer Poet hat gemusst geben sein Dorf soziale Lieder. Es ist gewinner Zeit, wenn ein jüdischer Poet hat gemusst geben sein Dorf nationale Lieder. Es ist gewinner Zeit, wenn ein jüdischer Poet hat gemusst geben sein Dorf Volksmotive. In bei allen unruhige Perioden der jüdischen Geschichte ist die jüdische Geschichte käme nicht wieder so unruhig für unsere Zeit, man das darf auch erzählen, selbst die jüdische Aufgabe. Aber jeder Mal, in jeden 20 oder 25 Jahren, jeden Vierteljahrhundert faktisch, aber wir reden in Terminen von Geschichte von der jüdischen Poesie, wird sehen, als jüdische Poeten haben gegeben akkurat das, was darin hat bedacht worden.
This is, of course, Gladstein's voice from an interview from 1955. And Gladstein is saying that the poet, the Yiddish poet, has a mission in the present. He's not constructing an archive, but creating a new and useful repertoire for his generation, for the Dor. One should also consider the temporal aspect of the post-Holocaust poetry, namely how time works regarding trauma, which is ever present. In this poem, Gladstein uses the verb geworden, became, to create an ever-changing repertoire rather than an archive. Thematically, he writes about the old world and the catastrophe and mourns the loss or many losses. However, his poetics aim not to freeze and preserve this world, but to create a new language and new ways to speak about these losses. The poet recalls, maybe counts, moments from his past, family members, childhood memories, a lexicon of losses. Nonetheless, that doesn't turn the poem into a lament, but turn the legacy of Rashi into a living force of interpretation. How do we think about trauma, anti-archival by definition? Asks Diana Taylor in her account on the archive and the repertoire. Gladstein's answer to this question might be, I take my individual, smaller holocausts, Khurbns, and cry out, let there be light. I turn memory into a ritual. I take my private archive, the Jewish history, and I Rashi it to create a new Khurbn repertoire. I take the darkness and I put it into radiant Jews. I keep recalling. Ich tu der Monen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll turn to our final panelist in this session, Miriam Udell from Emory University, Between Heroism and Coherence, How Yiddish Fiction Helped Child Readers Make Sense of the Holocaust. And I'll remind people to continue to drop questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them, and I look forward to a lively Q&A. Miriam, to you.
Okay, so like the other panelists, I feel a lot of gratitude for this forum, but instead of speaking about that at length, I want to invite you to take 15 seconds and roll your shoulders or your neck or whatever will help reground you for another 15 minutes of being talked at. What did children growing up in New York, Buenos Aires, or Montreal need to know about the events that came to be referred to as Der Dritte Khurbn, the third destruction? How could they best assimilate the knowledge? What did they need to feel? What did they need to do? While many American families struggled with the question of when it might be developmentally appropriate to begin educating children about the atrocities unfolding in Europe, the secularist Yiddishist world and its trusted teachers felt that they lacked the dubious luxury of waiting for some optimal imagined moment. Shortly after the war, educator, scholar, and children's author Yudel Mark would insist that, quote, the children of the Yiddish school may be said to have lived through the happenings themselves. For Mark, this immediacy was by design. In an editorial published early in the Annus Horribilis 1943 in the Pädagogischer Bulletin that he had founded 2 years earlier, Mark offered Yiddish teachers detailed instructions about how, vividly and unsparingly, to represent current events in Europe. He urged storytelling over independent or shared reading, offering a menu of 14 events and phenomena that teachers might relate to students on an escalating scale of horror, from burning Jewish books to, and this was encased in protectively distancing quotation marks, Jewish soap. Along with the dire facts, Mark insisted, children must be offered, quote, an element of heroism that might partially redeem even the most unspeakable tragedies. The self-sacrifice of the teachers who accompanied the children of the Medem Sanatorium to their deaths, for instance, or the courage of the Krakow Beis Yaakov schoolgirls who chose suicide over Nazi sexual slavery. Other heroic themes were more straightforward. The partisans, the underground movement, non-Jews who sheltered Jews or wore the yellow star, and tales of revenge against the oppressor. Reflecting in 1947 on the real-time candor in the Yiddish schools, Mark acknowledged, it may be that we sinned thereby against child psychology. a supposition that he raises only to dismiss it, continuing, "Nevertheless, we permitted ourselves to be influenced by the urge to take our children in as partners in our harsh fate, and to arm them with firmness, to brighten their spirits with the luster of the recent martyrdom of fellow Jews. There is no doubt," he concludes, "that the pupils of the Yiddish schools are more nationally minded now than they were before." Children were part of the Jewish body politic and could not be spared knowledge of harm to that body. Despite their identity as Americans, for the most part, the nation that now lay most urgent claim to them was das Yiddische Volk, the Jewish people. Marx saw clearly the tension between this national Yiddish interest in arming children with fuller knowledge and a private individual interest in protecting children's innocence. He understood parents' devotion to the liberal American creed as an obstacle to be circumvented by educators, and now I quote him at some length. "Our parents are progressive or liberal young people who speak only English amongst themselves, who have a secondary, not an active position on Jewish matters, and do not even have a sufficiently lively interest in Jewish education for their own children. National survival and the continuity of Yiddish culture or of the Eastern European heritage are not the slogans that speak to the hearts of parents today. For them, it is much more understandable to talk about the mental health of their children, about preventing painful psychological conflicts, about preparing them for the life and fate of a Jew. We must first of all convince the parents that a Jewish education, any sort of Jewish education, is a necessary thing. We are talking, after all, mainly to those whose religious impulse is weak and whose national instinct is obscured by all sorts of misconceptions that Americanism and progressivism will heal all possible wounds." However uncomfortable, Mark felt that school teachers should override American parental instincts toward safety and innocence if those luxury goods demanded ignorance of what every European Jewish child had been forced to know. That said, ideas about children's impressionability and susceptibility to harm were so widespread that the canon of children's Khurbn literature, even at its most raw, observes certain representational limits. Authors of fiction who addressed young readers, as opposed to diarists and memoirists writing for adults about childhood, were concerned to provide a layer of psychological insulation, especially with respect to violence, sex, and the ferocity with which Nazi policies specifically targeted children whom they deemed useless eaters. On the level of plot, perhaps the most significant deviation between the historical record and the juvenile literary tropes had to do with the destruction of the nuclear family as the container for children's care and nurture. Fictional child characters are often separated from their parents, but they usually remain under the care of adults in substitute, improvised family-like structures, hardly the case in the war's actual orphanhood crisis. Young American readers of Yiddish Holocaust fiction were largely shielded from the adult trope of children as smugglers par excellence, as well as the documented nature of ghetto children's imaginative play, whose dark themes helped suffering children process their fear, anger, and grief. Whereas child characters in the literary corpus are wholly desexualized, documentary sources record revulsion at the sexual precocity of ghetto-dwelling children. And while teenage boys and girls fought as in the ghetto and as partisans, fiction dwells on the role of younger children in providing humanitarian aid and even logistical support for those engaged in armed struggle, all without directly taking up arms or killing anyone. Jewish children in the literary canon are often frightened, their lives revealed as precarious, but seldom is a child's death frankly depicted, unless heroically, and usually then only in the background. Lera Roskis, who's here with us, commented to me that if your education about the war came entirely from the movies, you would think that most Jews, A, survived, B, by falling in love with and being rescued by good Nazis. If your education about the war came entirely from Yiddish children's literature, you'd think that most children, A, survived, and B, participated valiantly but non-violently in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In containing the bewildering horror within shapely narratives with beginnings, middles, and endings, Yiddish children's Holocaust stories offered young readers a way to make sense and meaning of the events. They invited readers to identify with the victims and survivors and called on the living children to imbue their own existence with meaning in response to the national tragedy. They juvenilized distinctive poetic approaches to confronting destruction. Throughout a long history of withstanding persecution, Jews had developed a sophisticated cultural technology for acknowledging and metabolizing violence. The time-tested strategy for responding to a new catastrophe was to fit it into a stylized pattern of historical events that the community had endured, to locate recent traumas on what Roskies calls a scale of archetypes. With respect to time, that meant flattening, blurring, or elision, known as panchrony. The violent events of linear time could be reckoned with, contained, by their insertion into the eternity of Jewish cyclical time, which always stood ready to incorporate fresh sorrows and newly sprung heroes. Since biblical times, liturgical poetry had reinforced the patterns of cyclical threat and salvation in concentrated form. Medieval martyrdom motifs could be retrieved and newly secularized to describe modern horrors. But prose, especially that written for children, also worked by the same logic. Forest-based partisans were the guerrilla Maccabees. Jews being deported on trains were the exiles from Jerusalem, driven out by the Babylonians and the Romans. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen was the Exodus. In his 1950 story collection, Vogel Kanarek und andere Meises, Moshe Shifris can bounce from Toms River, New Jersey, to Second Temple era Modi'in, to wartime Warsaw, because these times and places existed on a single continuum in the eyes of the Jewish child reader. The past was prefiguration, the present was echo, and intertextuality was the norm. We might think of this approach to history as Seder logic, following the liturgical construction of the Passover Seder, which is designed paradoxically to alarm and reassure, to provoke and solace. Participants are invited to regard themselves as if they personally had been redeemed from the bondage in Egypt, that is, to identify with Israelites and imaginatively project themselves into the text, feeling viscerally the ignominy of an abject nation. At the same time, a key passage sung aloud joyfully proclaims Vehi she'amda, that while in every generation malign actors have sought to eradicate the Jewish people, a debatable and somewhat indeterminate this has stood by our forebears and us, allowing the continued flourishing of the nation in toto. If the assaults are perpetual, runs the reasoning that undergirds this elaborate preemptive coping strategy, then they already constitute what Yiddish speakers would dismiss as a story with a beard, nothing new. Thus are the fangs of any fresh historical harm blunted. A Hitler who is not but a mustachioed Haman has been cut down to size. Of course, the novel Nazi system of mechanized murder stretched this Seder logic to its breaking point. But for the authors of Yiddish children's literature, the ordering function of narrative, the literal meaning of Seder, eked out a narrow victory over despair. Moshe Shifris's mimetically drawn story in the Warsaw Ghetto, also included in his 1950 collection, describes a family, or the surviving remnant thereof, sitting down to the Seder meal together in 5703, that is 1943. 10-year-old Yisrael, who sighs like his grandfather, huddles in sparse candlelight with his mother, older sister, and the aging patriarch. Just as they are about to begin the ritual meal, in bursts older brother Borech with 2 friends, a cache of weapons, and the news that they intend to meet the imminent German Aktion with bullets. God is not coming to deliver the people this Seder night, so grandfather, mother, and sister take up arms for themselves and join the newly begun uprising. They are living the Haggadah. To merely recite it would be superfluous. Despite Yudel Mark's half-rueful admission that we may have sinned against child psychology, his candid narrative-based approach comported with insights from research that would be conducted only later, emerging from the longitudinal study of survivors' lives. Aaron Antonovsky was born to working-class immigrant parents in Brooklyn in 1923. Growing up in the labor Zionist Hashomer Hatzair youth movement, he imbibed the tenets of socialism. Stationed in New Guinea, he served in the Second World War and then lived out his youthful ideals by spending 1948 as a founding member of a kibbutz. He completed a doctoral program in sociology at Yale before returning to Israel permanently in 1960. His subspecialty was the sociology of medicine, and after a stint in Jerusalem, he relocated to Beersheba and helped set up a new medical school there. His research had always focused on minorities and marginalization, immigrants, and victims of discrimination. In the late 1960s, while interviewing a group of postmenopausal women about the role of stress earlier in their lives, he located a subset of Holocaust survivors who had thrived despite all. Over the 1970s and 80s, Antonovsky would promulgate a new approach to conceptualizing human flourishing and its absence. Whereas most medical practitioners, whether of physical or behavioral health, treated an ordered state of good health as the given and disease as a deviation from the norm that required reversal or treatment, Antonovsky saw disorder as the human norm. If the conventional approach to medicine was to interrogate how disease comes about, or pathogenesis, then the new approach would reorient researchers' energies toward understanding salutogenesis, how good health arises. When Antonovsky shifted toward viewing dis-ease as a continuum and recognizing that some subjects thrive despite terrible adversity, he accounted for these outcomes by theorizing the central importance of a sense of coherence, or SOC, that could counter multiple entropic forces and promote well-being. SOC develops, he further theorized, when adverse events can be rendered comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful. What might otherwise be a trauma-inducing experience may be withstood if one can understand it, manage or mitigate it, and or make sense of it. As we consider 2 distinct populations of Jewish children affected by the Holocaust, those directly under Nazi attack and those witnessing the events from afar, Mark's pedagogical framework and Antonovsky's therapeutic one converge. While managing the myriad overwhelming events that constituted the Khurbn was out of the question, story made those events at least somewhat comprehensible and worked vigorously to fit the horror into a shapely structure of meaning. Reflecting in 1990 on his odyssey toward the salutogenic orientation, Antonovsky practically makes the case for Seder logic, the ordering function of narrative, writing, "The phrase, 'the world makes sense,' if understood in the emotional sense, is quite distinct from the cognitive perception of order. It refers to a way of looking at life as worth living, of seeing stressors as perhaps painful, yet worthy of being coped with rather than anesthetized. Seeing life in this way provides the motivational force," Antonovsky writes, "which leads one to seek to order the world and to transform resources from potential to actuality." Antonovsky succumbed to a brief illness at 71, still very much in the midst of empirical research intended to solidify his far-ranging theory. One of the questions he marked out for further study was whether the sense of coherence model could operate at a collective level beyond the individual. Culture, for Antonovsky, was one source of what he called generalized resistance resources, which are the tools that strengthen an individual's sense of coherence. Could a culture purposefully promulgate a sense of coherence in its participants? Reading Udall Mark's reflections on Khurbn pedagogy, both during and immediately after the war, it is clear that this is precisely what he and his colleagues in the Yiddish school systems and children's publishing arena aspired to do. So I've tried to give you something of the conceptual framework. This is part of a longer chapter with detailed readings of representative primary sources, which I hope you will encounter directly in my book when it's published next summer.
Shkoyach to all the presenters. This has been a really rich and fascinating panel. We have some questions that have already come in. I'll invite people to reflect in the moments ahead and add to that. I will call on our leader, Hannah, first. You have questions for at least 3 of the presenters.
I was just about to text you, please call on me last, but that's all right. So, because I want other people to get a chance. So, thank you. First of all, you know, when we scheduled this conference and we played endless amounts of Tetris to try to fit everything in, and I couldn't have imagined actually sitting and listening to 4 papers in a row would be so engaging for every single second. So my hat is really off to all of you. This was Dominic. I've never heard of this play before. There's so much to learn, but right now I'm interested in your framework. Can you say more about encounter, and maybe, because I love that also as a way to go back and think about the idea of censorship or authenticity, inauthenticity from earlier today, and think about encounter, that you know how that works. And Sam, this is just an ignorant question. I didn't know what that fallacy was you were talking about. So many fallacies in this world. So what is the map territory fallacy? And for Miriam, I was very struck that you noticed this dynamic of sexuality that happened with children and other Holocaust subjects, that during the Holocaust, children were, unfortunate doesn't describe it, horrendously sexualized, as in the people that I write about in my forthcoming book. And that was precisely one of the things that was so important to people during the Holocaust and within that Khurbn Yiddish culture. And it was precisely what so many agents of memory wanted to take out. And so if you could address that a little bit and expand, perhaps.
Thank you, Hannah. And since there's another question about encounter for Sam, let's bring Matthew Johnson in to ask that, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists for a few moments, and we'll come back to other questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for these. Were really wonderful papers. Sam, I guess it's just a question about what is it, if we take this series and the individual books as monuments, what does that do to our reading practice of them? What are the implications for reading, maybe both how you think about it, but then also about how the editor and the authors themselves thought about what it meant to read a monument or to read book monuments. And maybe if I could just throw in to Yael, like I think the use of the repertoire archive distinction was really compelling in reading Glattstein. And I wonder, again, like, is there also kind of repertoire of reading or like reading approaches that you're seeing in the post-war moment? Thanks.
Thanks very much. So now we've got things for all of our panelists to respond to. So I think I'll just go back to the order in which everyone presented and start with Dominic.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, it's definitely a framework that I need to be thinking about more. But I guess what I'm thinking about, it's a question of agency. Right? So if there are models of agency which are essentially about a person doing something because they want to achieve it. And then there are other models of agency that are more, what you might call a sort of more distributed idea of agency, that it's something that comes about because certain connections or certain conjunctions of things make things possible. And I suppose that's that second one, to sort of saying, like, you know, it's when things meet, things become possible. And so the different ways in which, you know, agency is distributed in that meeting mean that you don't necessarily have to see it as just like one side doing something to something else. Now, of course, there's a danger there anytime, and this would be true in just Holocaust studies in general, like, you know, there's a danger in just saying, granting agency to people at moments of extreme vulnerability and abjection, or even, and, you know, I mean, there are models of agency that would say, okay, well, I can attribute agency to things, right? Which I think in some sense can make sense, but obviously there's ways you want to be careful about that. But I suppose if you're using that to think about authenticity and censorship, I mean, I suppose that would, well, I mean, if we're thinking about authenticity, that would also be something that you're thinking about as not necessarily like, okay, here is this person expressing something, or here is something that's fundamentally like this and it's expressed in this way. It's something that comes about in a particular conjunction of things. So one example, I guess, would be this, you know, writing in Yiddish, writing about what happened in Yiddish is often a decision. It's not like that's just like the authentic expression of oneself, or even like authentic expression of one's culture. I mean, I think Eric and I were talking about this in the workshop yesterday. It's a way of making sense of what's happened and what it is that you want that event to, as far as you can make it mean something, mean. And I suppose that's also, you know, I think you can think about censorship in those ways as well. And one of those would simply be, you know, again, you can say this in a slightly flip way, but, you know, it's very, very difficult actually to make something completely disappear, right? And so what you often find then is that, you know, there's a way of reading something that has gone through censorship, or a way of understanding something that's gone through censorship, that isn't just about saying, well, it's not there anymore, okay, or it's been completely transformed, right? What you usually have is kind of layers of things that are coexisting, that you might be able to, since I like the word encounter, you might be able to encounter and decide to read in some way. So there's a certain element of, right, what's going on in the encounter. I mean, you can see this in what Agostinho is saying. What's going on in the encounter between the person who's remembering, as we're putting it, and the thing that they're remembering. But there's also the encounter between us and how we understand what's going on between them. And that also is about a certain set of ethical responsibilities and ways of dealing with it. And again, I think, you know, I think probably all of us as people who try to interpret things and write about things and make sense of things, it's not something that we're completely in control of, right? It's doing stuff to us at the same time as we're doing stuff to it. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to think about.
Dominic, thank you. Sam, you'd like to respond to questions that were posed to you. Maybe, Sam, this time you didn't unmute, so I'll ask you to do that.
I had to prove that my joke was not in vain, so there you go.
It was not gratuitous.
Hannah, in answer to your question about the map territory fallacy, apologies for not spelling it out in my talk, but I would have gone on even longer than I already had. Very briefly, it's the idea that a representation can correspond to the thing it represents. And in its strongest articulations, as in this wonderful and very brief Borges story from 1946, it sort of literalizes the fallacious literalization of that process. So the cartographers make a map of the empire that corresponds to the extent of the entire empire. And then this is taken up in various different ways for, I think, for Baudrillard, for example, and this is one of the better known articulations of the consequences or the workings of this fallacy. For Baudrillard, the fallacy is the premise of postmodernity, the postmodern condition, so that we are always mistaking something real for something not real. And what postmodernity introduces is the sort of trick of mistaking something not real for something that never existed. And you know, that's sort of an extreme version of this, but we're getting somewhere in that direction with Turkov's Das Polsche Judentum and with Trunk's Polen, because they're purporting to be describing, and Trunk goes on at length in various places about the balance between historical objectivity and literary aestheticism, which on the one hand is very interesting because there is an element of historiography in his work, but on the other hand, it's preposterous because the entire thing is a literary memoir. And nobody in their right minds would read it as a historiography, and yet reviewers then and you know people who encounter it now tend to view it as I do while reading it, as an amazing resource for knowledge about Polish Jewry. So Trunk was had an amazing rabbinical Yiddish, and the first volume goes into like super detail about all of that, and it's, you know, it's tempting to read these as historical sources. So that's the problem. And then the way that the books negotiate that problem is what makes it interesting, because of course every work is subject to this, but these literary monuments make a claim to something that no stone monument would ever make a claim to, right? A stone monument is always aware of the fact that it's a metonymy, whereas the literary monuments, because of their potential for seriality and constant expansion, can make this claim to totality. Which is crazy and weird. And I guess that connects to Matt's question about what does it mean to read it? And I mean, that's the big question, really. And so I'm constantly thinking through different answers to it, and I'm not going to get locked down until I write an eventual intro to the book. But I think there's a couple of models. One is the Matseve model, the gravestone model. And in volume number 4 of Das Polsche Judentum, Manchurov Shtetl Sokolov by Peretz Kranatstein writes in the introduction, straight up, this book should be a Matseve, right? Lots of people write things like that. You see in so many post-Holocaust books, little inscriptions, epigraphs, dedicatory things saying, you know, this book is a Matseva. Kranatstein explains, we don't have graves for our family because they were plowed over or bombed out, or our relatives weren't buried at all. So use the book as an ersatz. And it seems he means it literally, for gravesite kind of ritual commemorations. Instead of going to the cemetery on the yahrzeit, take out the book. Don't even read it. Use it as a kind of object. So that's the Matseve model, a replacement for gravesite rituals. But interestingly, that sort of metaphoric movement doesn't go in the other direction. And this shows, I think, another important difference between literary monumentality and stone monumentality. And that is, you know, if you can use a literary Matseve as a replacement for a gravestone, you can't really do what often happens to monuments with the literary monument. You know, so think of the periodic outrage over people having picnics, you know, at the Berlin Memorial for the Murdered Jews of Europe, or like, you know, posting their thirst trap pictures on dating sites. That simply doesn't work with a book. It's right for all the logistical reasons because of the different medium, but it also doesn't work with a book because a book has a narrative voice that a stone monument doesn't have in the same way. And that problem, and I'm going to end there, but it gets back to Matt's mention of Musil, right? That famous articulation by Robert Musil that a monument is the thing that you ignore when you're walking by it. Nothing is as forgettable as a monument, he says. Nothing is as forgettable as a monument, in part because you can walk by it, right? I mean, a book that you don't read is also forgettable, but once you've read it, you're in a different realm. But also because the interpretive premise, the heuristic starting point, the entire framework of a monument can be sacrificed and lost too easily. And that's the problem. And that was, you know, the whole problem in terms of actually building monuments that, you know, was being debated in Vienna in that period about how you make something. And the way the question was crystallized was, you know, in the debate about Hildebrandt's monument, how do you solve the problem that you can't see a whole monument all at once, right? If the three-dimensionality is part of it, but you can only see one dimension converted into the sort of visual, cognitive, one-dimension flat image that we process, then a monument can't work. So you have to do something about that, right? So a book, in presenting itself as a monument, introduces an entirely different set of questions. So in a sense, what happens with the suggestion of a literary monument is that all the questions about visual monumentality need to be set aside, and there's a different starting point. And that's why it's also important to take into account the preceding tradition of literary monumentality. That's more of like the start to an answer than an actual answer, but there you go.
Thanks very much, Sam. Yael, you had a question from Matthew Johnson.
Yeah, just thank you. Just to make sure I'm answering the right question. You ask about repertoire reading of the poems?
I guess I was just thinking if I understood correctly about like this idea of like the kind of embodied practices that Glotstein's pointing to in the book, which you so like really compellingly kind of elucidated. But then also I was wondering if there's also kind of this embodied repertoire of reading practices that we can also see in the post-war period, or if there's even a way to like approach that or to research.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to answer. I'm not sure I can. Regarding Gladstein, he has this poem, Gan v'Zecharain in Sidr. So he really wants to be a part of the Jewish repertoire, so to speak, like the prayer book, which is maybe the ultimate repertoire, right? Because you say it and you reenact it every day. So I think that was what Gladstein would have liked. That this is the way he would have liked to be read in. But I'm not sure it's well, since he's a poet and not a prophet, so it's kind of a problem. And I'm not aware of reading practices which are of Yiddish poetry which are repertoire or in the ritual mode. But I think this is where he was going to as a writer.
No, thank you. And Miriam, a question for you from Hannah.
Sure. Okay. Do you want me to try to string together responses to other questions, or we'll just take them one at a time?
Go for it. Sure.
All right. So Hannah had asked about the desexualization of children.
Actually, I'm sorry. I'll just pause just so we have clarity. Maybe I'll bring in those questioners and let them ask those questions, and then I'll let you string them together. So Sonia and Anna. Sonia, you want to pose your question, please?
Yes, thanks for the great panel. So my question's for Miriam. So I'm thinking about the role of children of socialist parents in Glotstein's Emil and Karl and Rachmiel Brex's Berla in Ghetto. And I was curious about the role that the history of Jewish leftism can and does have in your corpus. And if Yael had any thoughts about how the poems she's addressing are maybe in conversation with works that were published by Glotstein at a similar time to Emil and Karl, which was 1940, that would also be interesting to hear.
Sonja, Anastasius.
Yes, hi. My question is also about Emil and Carl. Ever since Jan Schwartz told me about this novel 10 years ago, it became like really my favorite to go to teach text for sure. Emil and Carl, as I said, and my question is all about friendship. And kids love friendship, and our students love friendship. And it's, Sonja's thinking about this from the leftist, from the socialist position. I'm thinking about this Jews, non-Jews friendship, which is also a lot on my mind today for many different reasons. So I'm just curious about that as a value in children's books written in Yiddish, because Gladstein said goodbye to the world, a few years before he wrote Emil and Carl. So, I'm curious, is this possible as a value, as something that happens in children's literature in Yiddish often? So thank you.
Okay, sure.
Thanks, Donna.
All right. So these questions are actually very closely related because in general, one of the things that Naomi Power Kadar talks about in her wonderful study of Yiddish children's periodicals is the need for Die Linke, for the socialists and communists, those farthest out on the left, to respond to increasing anti-Semitism in Europe throughout the 30s. And one of the ways that they do that is to really kind of emphasize themes of Jewish particularism. So the universalism was there, and it was a kind of principled stance from the beginning, but really picking up at the time of Nuremberg and subsequently even the most, left-leaning communist presses I should say, in the Americas. This is particularly true in North America and Latin America. It's a somewhat different situation in the Soviet Union, but they really kind of lean into particularistic Jewish identity. And so we see in the immediate kind of post-war writings for children, this real emphasis on Jewish national identity and the needs of das Yiddische Volk, and then there will be a sort of a wink and a nod to communist commitment that if you're well versed, you get it. Like you'll notice that the sun is always rising in the east, and that the sunrise is always red, and that there are always, red flags that are kind of strategically visible in the distance as the character looks pensively toward the ruined city of Warsaw, that sort of thing, and that maybe redemption will come from the east, but. So that's about the left, that it's there, but it really kind of takes a back seat to more Jewish nationalist imagery and themes. And then this is closely linked to the question of friendship, because if we look at Jewish children's literature as a total project, depictions of friendship between Jews and non-Jews are, number one, rare, and number two, always politically pointed. So the two go-to examples would be Emil and Carl, and another work that has the names of the boys as the title, which is Liam und Patrick by Leib Kvitko, and that's also very much about this kind of coalition that can be formed, this alliance that can be formed between Jews and enlightened leftists who are not anti-Semitic. So I also want to say, though, about these friendships that they have to be considered not only in terms of Jewish children's literature in toto, but also specifically about the construction of what I call Yiddish boy world. These friendships can flourish among boys. Girls in Yiddish children's literature are almost always depicted as being alone, off on their own in some way. They might have a family circle, but they're very seldom depicted in relation to friends, whereas the social relations of boys are much more of a recurrent theme. So there's just much more friendship, period, and also a lot of texts about uneasy friendship, frenemies, and that continues into the depiction of Holocaust themes for children. So we have two best friends who come together to rescue a set of twins and take them through the sewage tunnels from the ghetto out to the partisans in the forest, and they rescue these infant twins. We also see frenemies who had never been particularly close before, but in the Warsaw Ghetto fighting, one of them is shot, the other one discovers him, he seems to still be breathing, and the former frenemy becomes a friend who facilitates his evacuation and rescue. So in the Holocaust specifically, a lot of friendships turn into friends on a mission to save somebody, to do something for the Jewish people. But there isn't really a lot of friendship between Jew and non-Jew unless there's some sort of more pointed political purpose for depicting that.
Maybe a quick follow-up for you. Are there depictions in literature you're looking at of marriages between Jews and non-Jews?
And sorry, could I follow up on the follow-up? Just expand even more broadly, what models of kinship do we
so glad
find there?
for all this enthusiasm. I just want to remind everyone that we will have to finish on time. Okay, so take that and interpret that note as you like.
We'll make that happen, Hannah.
So no, like short answer, no representations of exogamy in children's literature, which is interesting. Kinship models, a great text for, so I talked about how the most important deviation from the historical record is that many children were orphaned, left completely on their own, whereas in the literary sources, there's always some sort of a substitute family-like structure. So there's a wonderful text from this collection published by the communists in Mexico City in 1950, Kinderhelden, a short story about a girl named Reisele who makes her way out to a partisan encampment in the forest, and her presence reawakens the paternal feelings of one of the most combat-hardened soldiers who misses his own daughter and who's been kind of hardened and emotionally frozen, and Reisele's presence turns him back into a dad. So there's a lot of surrogacy and very traditional family models that are being approximated or replicated in some way after rupture.
Thanks, Miriam. Sam, so the huge challenge for you, there's a bunch of other questions for you, and we don't have time for them all, but maybe very quickly to sort of collapse a couple of them together. A question from Yaakov, which I'm not going to turn to him just for purposes of time, but between pre and post Khurbn book monuments, and also a question from Anna Klotz about the inward versus outward, and she suggests a different way of looking at it, that those, sort of literal sort of public monuments be more sort of more directed inward or more outward, and the book monuments, because of issues of language barriers, more inward. Can you say something about that in about a minute or a minute and a half?
Here we go.
Do something to respond
to Yaakov's question. There's a lot of overlaps, and there's also a lot of smaller distinctions, but the main one I would say is that in the post-Holocaust literary monuments, you begin to get this claim to totality, the map territory fallacy, which in part is an effort to recreate, reclaim, rediscover something which is lost or thought and felt to be lost, but also may have to do with larger forces in the transition through modernity into post-modernity at a turning point of genocide and cultural rupture. Short answer. The question about inward and outward monuments is not only about placement, it's also about very much about audience, and not only can the audience access it, but does the audience want to access it? So, you know, I think a good case study for this is Stolpersteine, where ostensibly everybody is supposed to be subject to it, because as soon as you trip on it, then you have the meaning. But of course, most people don't even trip on it, but if you do, it's just as if you're tripping on anything else. The people for whom that's a meaningful experience are the people who want it to be a meaningful experience. And that's the case in general, I think, with any monument, right? But then there's also the question of who is building it for whom. And so the question of audience, obviously, with a Yiddish literary text makes that very clear. Whereas the question of a statue, right, there's, or a grave marker or something else like that, needs to be sort of triangulated between its placement, the monumental landscape that it's participating in, and the forms of visual and textual accessibility that it presents.
Thanks, Sam, for doing that so concisely. Thank you again, everyone. Virtual applause to all of you, and to everyone who contributed fascinating questions, including to one from the general audience that was really interesting, we just didn't get to, and there's some follow-up comments. So this is obviously generating a lot of thinking. Look forward to seeing you all again in the next session after the break.
Half an hour break, everyone. Panelists and moderator, please sign in 10 minutes early to check your microphone. You can pop in and out. Enjoy the break. Wow.